Welcome everyone. My name is Amy Ravis-Fury and I'm Avodah's program director in Kansas City. Avodah develops lifelong social justice leaders whose work is informed by Jewish values and who inspire the Jewish community to work towards a more just and equitable world. As we confront issues of systemic and racial injustice that the pandemic has only served to illuminate, we have asked ourselves how Avodah can best use the resources and networks that we have cultivated over the past 3 years here in Kansas City to meet the urgency of this moment. And so I would like to welcome you to the community conversation, the first of our endeavors, but not the last, where together we will explore and grapple with what it means to become an anti-racist Jewish community. I want to thank our co-sponsors for joining us, Jewish Vocational Service, JCRB AJC, and Congregation Kol Ami. Elul, the last month of the Jewish year, which we're in now, is traditionally a time of introspection and personal reflection. Elul is a moment to begin the process of Heshbon HaNefesh, an accounting of the soul. Elul is a moment when we account not only for what we have done, but also for what we have not done, for ourselves, our community, and the world. As we approach the new year, we atone for the ways that we have come up short in the past and recommit ourselves to justice, solidarity, and hope in the year to come. Today is only the start of our conversation, certainly not the end. Avodah and our partners are committed to continuing the conversation and, most importantly, committed to tangible actions that will undo systemic racism and dismantle white supremacy. I want to introduce you to an incredible panel of people who inspire and lead the Jewish community forward at this critical moment. So first we have Rabbi Doug Alpert. Welcome. Doug is a lifelong Kansas City resident who completed his rabbinic studies at the Academy for Jewish Religion and was ordained in May 2012. Rabbi Alpert is also an attorney and received his Juris Doctorate in May 1983 from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. In 2011, Rabbi Alpert became the spiritual leader of Congregation Kol Ami, an urban, progressive congregation in Kansas City. Rabbi Alpert is a dedicated leader in the community. He is involved in nearly 24 social justice organizations, serving in numerous leadership capacities. Jansen Apple, a Kansas City native, graduated from Pembroke Hill in 2019. At Pembroke, she served as student body president and captain of the volleyball team, as well as youth governor of Missouri in her senior year. As a rising sophomore at Carleton College in Minnesota, she works for the college president, serves on student senate, works for the admissions department as a tour guide, coaches the men's volleyball team, and participates in varsity volleyball. Hilary Cohen-Singer is executive director of Jewish Vocational Service, which provides programs that help refugees and individuals with disabilities achieve self-sufficiency and become fully integrated into the community. She joined JVS in 2010 and has been executive director since 2014. Hilary has over 20 years of experience in nonprofit leadership, program development, and strategic planning. Hilary holds a BA in political science from Columbia University and a BA in Modern Jewish Studies from the Jewish Theological Seminary. She earned her Master's of Public Administration from the Wagner School of Public Service in New York, at New York University. Gabriella Geller, a native of Kansas City, is the Executive Director of JCRB AJC Kansas City. Previously, Gavi directed the policy and advocacy efforts of the Jewish Community Relations Council of St. Louis. During her year of service as an Avodah Corps member, Gavi worked at the National Immigrant Justice Center, helping detained and LGBTQ immigrants. Gavi also serves on the Avodah Kansas City Advisory Council. Gavi holds a master's in Jewish cultural arts from George Washington University. And lastly, but certainly not least, our moderator and my colleague and friend, Nate Looney, serves as Avodah's manager of racial justice initiatives, leading diversity strategies at Avodah with a focus on Jews of color. Nate is the CEO and owner of Westside Urban Gardens, an urban agricultural company based in Los Angeles. Nate joined the U.S. Army National Guard in 2003. Nate was part of rescue efforts during Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and deployed to Iraq in 2008. Nate decided to leave the Army to finish his college education and begin his gender transition. In 2015, Nate graduated with a BA in business from American Jewish University. And with that, again, I welcome you. I really appreciate you being here to take part in such a critical conversation, and I turn it to you, Nate.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you all for taking the time to be here with us today. So before I get started, I just want to touch on a few housekeeping things, and then we're going to dive right into this. So for the folks viewing right now, if you have a question, you can use the Q&A box to ask your questions, and then they will get to us that way. And then if you have any issues and need tech support, the Avodah participant is our tech support person, so feel free to reach out to them if you need to. And so with that, I want to dive on in. One of the things that I always like to talk about when we're talking about race is that it's an uncomfortable topic. No matter who you are, no matter what your color is, it requires a level of vulnerability, even if you are just viewing this. So I say that to lean in and stick with the discussion, and even if there are things that you find uncomfortable or things that don't exactly you agree with. The importance of this is to create dialogue and learning. So with that, what are we doing here right now? Why are we talking about race? Apologize, one more step back. As a veteran, I would be wrong to not acknowledge the fact that today is 9/11 and acknowledge the fact that lives were lost both in New York and in Virginia and on the plane that landed. So I want to acknowledge that and acknowledge the service members that have since lost their lives as a result of 9/11. Now that that's done, let's lean into something that's a little bit more difficult. So what are we doing here right now? I have, the privilege of have been to Kansas City before twice while under my urban agriculture hat. And it's a lovely city, but in some ways there's some polarization that exists within Kansas City. And so it's more than ever, it's important for us to be having this discussion right now, given everything that happened this year, specifically with everything that happened in June with the death of George Floyd and other African Americans that lost their lives to the hands of police. And in addition to that, the other African Americans that from that time period have been found hanging in different places and all have been marked as suicide without any further investigation. I want to acknowledge that this is all a part of why we are talking about this now, because this has some impact on the Jewish community in addition. One other thing that Amy mentioned earlier was the impact of COVID-19. We understand and we've seen that COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted people of color, both economically and physically with health outcomes. And that also has had an impact on our Jewish community and our JOC community. It's important to talk about intersectionality and what does it mean to hold multiple identities at any given time. Any of us are holding multiple identities at any given time. For myself in particular, as was talked about in my bio, I'm an Army veteran. I identify as a man, but I wasn't born identifying as such. I'm an entrepreneur, do all kinds of different work, but then also my religious engagement is a significant part of my life. My observance level is a very important part of what makes me me. And without all of those different parts, you don't get all of Nate. And so I would say that the same thing exists for any one of us, that you can't cut out the lineage or the legacy of your grandparents and still be who you are. All of these things are important to honor and name. And then also it's important to think about the time period that we're in right now. We're looking at Rosh Hashanah right now. It's right around the corner. So what does it mean for us to really take account of what this year has meant for us individually and what is meant for us as a community. There has been significant growth in the past few months in the Jewish community, and it's exciting to see what is going to happen going forward as a result of this growth. So once again, I invite you to lean in, be vulnerable, ask questions of us, and let's get this started. So the questions that I have for the panelists, I'm going to be doing a little bit of popcorning around, but I want to sort of start with something a little bit on that I want to ask of everyone to sort of popcorn around as you feel fit. When did you first become aware of how race played a role in your life? And feel free to mute or unmute yourself and jump on in with this one.
Well, if nobody else is going to dive in, I will. When I was a kid, and I think I'm the senior member of this group. So back in the 60s, for a couple of reasons. One, I just growing up, like a lot of kids, I was into sports and had sports heroes, and somehow my sports heroes that I gravitated to were Black athletes, and not just for their athletic prowess, but the things they seemed to do away from playing field. So people like Bill Russell and Muhammad Ali and Arthur Ashe were people that I just gravitated to for reasons I can't explain. What I can explain is that my father, of blessed memory, was a builder, a general contractor, and a real estate developer, and he did a lot of work in the Black community, particularly with the Black Economic Union. And at the time, he was about the only white developer in town who was working with the BEU. And he didn't do it out of some forced sense of, look at me, look how progressive I am. It was just business with him. And so the relationships came pretty naturally. And that's kind of my grounding in all this, is that it's just relationships, and why not? And to not have the opportunity to engage in those relationships, yeah, there's a sense of justice to it, but it just seems dumb not to. And that's kind of where I land in all this. And then it kind of grew out from there. In a prior lifetime, I was executive director of the Kansas City Jazz Commission, and it's a Black art form, and it got me more deeply involved with the Black community in Kansas City. So those are kind of the foundational pieces of why I'm involved in the work now.
Thank you. I'm a big Mingus fan, so.
Oh, our previous cat was named Mingus, so we'll talk more.
Yep.
I'll go next. I would say from a pretty early age. I mean, I was adopted by an all-white family, so I can maybe we'll watch a princess movie, and I'm like, well, why does my cousin look like that princess, but I don't? Or my grandpa will joke about, he would take me out to the park and people would ask if I was okay because this man was trying to take me home. And I'm like, my grandpa's just trying to take me home. It's like, I don't know why that would weird because, I'm like 4. So it doesn't connect that something's there. But I think I picked up more and more like, why would people be that concerned if, there wasn't something wrong with me or there wasn't something there? So I think that was from a pretty young age.
Thank you. It's interesting how some of those questions could be very innocent and you don't even realize what's going on. Like I think about, I think I was maybe 28 years old when I realized that Band-Aids were intended to be flesh colored. Like the things that you innocently don't think about, but really become a thing, like, oh, but it's not meant to be my flesh color. Okay, well, I still need a Band-Aid. Oh, please, Gabriella or Hilary.
Yeah, I think, mulling on this question, I think as a young child, I actually was much more aware of Blackness than I was of whiteness, right? Like in terms of race, because that is the way that our society frames it. I don't think it was until sort of later and you start developing a more like academic and educated framework for discussing race when you really understand the concept of whiteness. But as a child, you certainly understand the concept of not being white. And that was made aware to me, you know, I remember being a very, very small child, like in the school bus, and a Black kid was on the receiving end of a horrifically racist comment from one of my schoolmates. And I remember like my face just getting really hot and really being so flushed and upset over it. But it's almost from the moment that you start understanding the world around you, you become aware of those things, I think, as children.
So I think for me, I think a lot like Gavi, right? There was an awareness of non-white, right? More than an awareness of being white or of whiteness. And I recently had a conversation at work where we were asked to reflect on our identity either as white people or as people of color. And it gave me a moment of pause because as a Jewish person, I don't necessarily know that I have a conception of my own white identity, though I am the recipient of white privilege, and right, I am certainly not a person of color. So I think that adds a little bit to the confusion around this a little bit. But I would say that maybe unlike some of the others in this group, I was maybe a little bit of a late bloomer in terms of my own consciousness about this. You know, I grew up in Kansas City. I attended the Hyman Brand Hebrew Academy. I lived in Johnson County. And so the sort of baseline, right, what I thought of as normal, right, typical my experience, was one of overwhelming whiteness. And it wasn't until I moved to New York for college, and that was not sort of the status quo, that I was able to sort of reflect back on my childhood and notice sort of only in retrospect the lack of diversity in the communities and the spaces that I occupied.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an interesting thing when that awareness or that shift happens. I think back to a recent trip I took to South Africa, and that was the first time in my life that I was a part of a majority. And it was a completely different experience to walk around and be like, no, I really am a part of a majority. I've never experienced this before. And so I can translate that into possibly or potentially what your experience is like, Hilary, like day to day, surrounded by whiteness, and then to have the that shift of awareness of that no longer quite being the case. Thank you all for that. So the next question that I want to ask, I'm going to pitch this one to you, Gavriela, because I think this is a good fit for you. What does it mean to grapple with your own implicit bias?
Yeah, I mean, I think that means having an awareness every day of the ways in which that implicit bias will surface, and trying to actively fight against it, right? Like, implicit bias means that through existing in this societal framework that we do, we receive messages day in and day out about race and about different communities and inferiority and superiority and stereotypes. And recognizing implicit bias doesn't necessarily mean that you are ever able to get rid of it completely, but it means that you are able to acknowledge it and sort of press pause on the recording so that the messages that you're receiving don't automatically then go back out. And so I think that is really just a daily occurrence of trying to be cognizant and recognizing the ways that those messages have shaped us and shaped our thinking, and the ways that race does affect the society that we walk through every day.
Thank you. Absolutely. And I think it's also, I should have mentioned this before, it's important to note that no one is immune to having implicit bias. Like across the board is something that exists in all of us. And it's really important to acknowledge or reconcile with yourself where that lives and how it shows up in your everyday life. So the next question is for you, Rabbi Alpert. Since you are Kansas City, holding it down the longest, historically in Kansas City, Jews were disenfranchised along the lines of other marginalized communities, related to housing, medical care, things of that nature. Currently, this isn't quite the case for the majority Ashkenazi Jewish community in Kansas. We aren't excluded from, Jewish. There's a Jewish hospital. There's a Jewish country club. So the question is, what does it mean to acknowledge the clear difference between the Jewish community and the POC, people of color community in Kansas City today? And how do you sort of reconcile that difference?
I'm not sure I reconcile it so much. It's interesting. Growing up, my family ended up like in the furthest out suburb. And for everybody on the call who knows the city, I grew up at around 103rd and Row, and that was the end of civilization when I was a kid. There was nothing out from our house other than farmland. But what ended up happening, there were like 4 other Jewish families in the neighborhood, and one of the first Black families to move to Johnson County moved in catty corner from our house. So those were our neighbors. And what I would discover later in life, it's because there were deed restrictions in the more inner suburbs that wouldn't allow Jews or Blacks to move into those, we ended up with this little enclave further out. So, as a result of some redlining and covenants and deed restrictions, we ended up together. But that said, I'm pretty forward in Black space and with Black community organizing groups in saying that Jews were full participants in white flight. And to the extent that, that's what we wanted, and we wanted the same idyllic suburban life that everybody else wanted, to the extent that we were able to access that, we did it. And we essentially abandoned the inner city. History, after Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination, it was during Pesach, and there were about 2-3 nights of riots, and you had to go through National Guard checkpoints to get home from Passover Seder. And that was kind of the end of the Jewish presence in the central city. There was really, it had already started to happen long before that, but that was really the final blow, if you will. We had relied a lot on our previous, what we perceived to be our previous relationships with the Black community from back then, and our involvement with the civil rights movement and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel on a national scale and locally here, and Gavi knows the history, David Goldstein with JCRB. And those relationships were important, but a lot has happened since then. So, what informs me with that is another guest to the party, is the understanding that we need to form these relationships anew in a lot of ways. And we can't rely on what was, and we have to acknowledge, without, flagellating ourselves with guilt, we have to acknowledge that we were participants in white flight, that we have been able to access white privilege in certain ways, and kind of move forward from there, and really listen to what Black leaders in the Black community are asking for now, and to stand with them and be supportive in the process.
I want to piggyback on Rabbi Alpert's remarks, because I also want to, knowing that this is a majority Jewish audience who's listening to this, really acknowledge as well the reality of anti-Semitism, both historically and currently. And encourage a nuanced thought around this issue, that we can hold both the reality of anti-Semitism with what Rabbi Alpert is saying in terms of, this historic privilege or benefits that white American Jews have received that Black Americans have not. And we can hold those things simultaneously, like that we, yes, historically can acknowledge all of our synagogues and our, menorah hospital and all Jewish institutions are built on the outskirts of Leawood because we weren't allowed in Leawood. My grandfather wasn't allowed to buy a house in Leawood, and all of those things are true. We continue also to grapple with and wrestle with a huge resurgence of anti-Semitism today, and know that we economically and in other ways did not face oppression in the same way that Black Americans did, and that we've been able to inherit, familial wealth through several generations that puts us, a lot of white Jews, in a very different spot today than some Black Americans would be, and that we can hold those things simultaneously.
Thank you for acknowledging that, Gabriella. I think it's important when we think about this. As a military veteran, I think about the Montgomery GI Bill and VA benefits for soldiers coming back from World War II. And African-American soldiers were excluded from certain benefits. And there's an acknowledgement that I see, or conversation happening now around the implications of that within the community. So I really appreciate you pointing out the intersectionality and the complexity of this issue. It's not an easy one-sided thing. So this next question is for Jancyn. And I'm asking you this specifically because I think you might have a specific take on this. Prior to entering a Jewish space, what are some of the things that you think of as it relates to your identity?
I mean, that's quite a question to unpack.
Yeah.
Do you mean in the sense, like, if someone hadn't said that I was Jewish, what else would I identify as, or something like that? Or
So let me clarify. So if you're walking into a synagogue for the first time,
mm-hmm.
What are some of the thoughts that go through your head as you're getting ready to walk into that new space, that new Jewish space?
Yeah, I mean, really, well, first, kind of the question I think everyone does, do my family members know anybody that goes here? Because I feel like everyone's family kind of knows at least 6 or 7 people that are in there. Really, unfortunately, in Kansas City, after 2014, almost every synagogue has a heavily armed police officer. And so that kind of triggers a completely different experience, I think, for me than it does for some other congregants walking in, where, like, they're there for a very legitimate reason, and they're there to keep people safe because of a very real incident that happened, 5-6 years ago. But it's still that kind of initial, like, oh, okay, I need to walk straight, get in and get to where I'm supposed to be, and not, look disruptive or look suspicious. I would say, I think normal social anxiety things, like, do I know anybody here? Am I gonna have people to sit with? But yeah, I think the involvement of security and people around has made it a pretty different environment for me. Also, Trump's election played a huge role. That was my sophomore year of high school. So it's when, I wouldn't say we're not really kids anymore. People are forming very real opinions. People are, you're interacting in more adult conversations now. And it played out in the synagogue when, the rabbi's like, what are things you're grateful for? And people stand up and say American liberty. And it's like, well, okay, that's not really the train of thought we were going down. But that new political landscape played a lot into the Jewish community because, you have historically Republican, historically conservative families that now may be Trump supporters, and that plays a different role into some of these conversations. So I think as the political landscape evolved, so too did, the community landscape. Everything changed altogether.
Sure. Thank you for that. Actually, as I was thinking about it, Hilary, I would like to pitch this question to you as well as someone that is deeply involved in education and involved in the Jewish community. I'm curious about what is that experience like for you, and what are some of the things that you think about as you're entering a Jewish space for the first time?
Yeah, I think for me, there's a little bit of a question around what is a Jewish space, and what do we, right? How far out does that sort of reverberate? Certainly, synagogues are Jewish spaces. My daughter goes to the Hyman Brand Hebrew Academy. That's a Jewish space. But if you walk into the Jewish Community Center, is that a Jewish space? Right? Who's welcome there? How do we signal who's welcome there, and who belongs there? We have 2 social service agencies in Kansas City that are really rooted and connected to the Jewish community, but serve a predominantly non-Jewish population. So the agency that I work for, Jewish Vocational Service, and Jewish Family Service. And what does it mean for those spaces? Are those Jewish spaces? How do we signal, right, that we are a Jewish space? How do we signal that we are welcoming to all people? And I think one of the things that for me is important to do at JVS is to be able to convey the message that, yes, this is a Jewish agency, right? It's the very first word of our name. This is a Jewish space, but it is a space that is for all people, and that those 2 things are not disconnected, right? That it is a space for all people in large part because it is a Jewish space, and we are committed to being welcoming and open and inclusive and intentional about how we convey that. And I really identify with what Jancyn said. We've had lots of conversations after the 2014 incidents and continuing to today about what the role of security looks like at our building. We have Jewish in our name. It's on a big sign in our lawn. We are at 46th and Paseo, which is in the center of the city. But we've made a conscious choice not to have security present, which is not to say that that is the right choice for everybody, but in part because our commitment to our clients and the people who are coming in to be served by our agency, we want everybody to feel welcome.
If I can follow up on that a little bit, it feels like there are 2 issues going. One is what defines Jewish space? What does Jewish space look like? And the other is how to be Jewish in non-Jewish space. And let me address the latter one first. As a congregation who actually doesn't own a building and leases space and is not always in one place, and particularly we have a community garden, and we consciously put it east of Troost, not too far actually from Jewish Vocational Service, in what is recognized here in Kansas City as the Black community. And we, purposely wanted to expose our folks to space, to people not like us, to issues that, if you're in the urban core, you tend to engage in issues you otherwise don't so readily engage with. So that's one piece. The piece about what Jewish space looks like, it was somewhat defined in my parents' generation, again, because they couldn't access in a lot of different venues, non-Jewish space for professional reasons or social reasons. So the synagogue became the core of their existence, not just for religious purposes. And my folks, we celebrate all the holidays, but my father wouldn't go and daven per se. He didn't go and study Torah every week, But it was important. It wasn't even an issue whether or not you belonged to a synagogue. You had to belong to a synagogue. It's not the case so much now. So where in that sort of environment my parents kind of came up in, created a sense of cultural Judaism, I think, a bit more. For my congregation, that doesn't work anymore because everybody came from somewhere else. And while that may be an uncomfortable environment, it was for me growing up to be on the inside. We got the jokes, we knew each other, it was all very comfortable, but it was all somewhat exclusionary at the same time. Whereas being the rabbi at a relatively new congregation where everybody came from somewhere else compels you to find yourselves with definitions that are more religion-based than cultural-based. And I think that's kind of gives us a new sense of who we are and where we're going.
Sure. I think that speaks to the fluidity of the Jewish community now. As you're talking about like communities and shuls being the focal point of any individual community, the fact that there's so much movement through our country, we're a fluid community now. It's not quite fixed like it was. Gabriella, I see your question, your hand. Go ahead and make a comment, and then we're going to pivot because we're about to run a little short on time.
Well, I just want to pick up on a point that Hilary said, which something I don't have an answer for, but for us to chew on, I think, as a community, which is this tension, I think, that we're experiencing between keeping our community safe and keeping our community inclusive. And what does that mean for us as a community that highly values our relationships with law enforcement, and the ways in which law enforcement helps to keep our community secure, with what that means for people of color walking into our spaces, or what that means for our partners in communities of color who are not treated fairly by the same law enforcement partners that we then work with. And I think that there's a real tension there that our community, should continue to think about and explore.
Yeah. And as somebody with a law enforcement background, I can say that it's part of the challenge is acknowledging that there is a real threat of anti-Semitism, and then acknowledging that what law enforcement looks like and what good situational awareness looks like isn't always exactly what's being performed in our communities when we are bringing folks in to serve as a law enforcement protective role. So we have time for one or two more questions, and then I want to open it up to some of the questions that we've received through Q&A. So the first question that I want to ask, and I just want to pitch this out to everyone, is how has your Jewish identity impacted your commitment to racial justice?
I think I'm in kind of I hate to say unique rut, but it definitely in these last few months has felt like that, like just kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, because I would say my entire Jewish existence. So even though I live at 37th and Holmes, I live in the inner city, I'm 2 blocks from Troost. Going into any Jewish space in Kansas City, I'm entering a white space because I'm going to Johnson County. I'm going to a place where no matter what, I will stand out. I'm the other. So having these kind of difficult conversations with people who have no concept of systemic racism, no concept that most of the time the only Black people they see if they're not me are people, serving them, people being the janitors, people being the cleaners. Like it gets very difficult because a lot of the time you can't shake people's family opinions. You can't shake the way they were raised a lot of the time. And so it's hard to get people to conceptually understand that these are very real life situations. I think for me, and my parents will kind of agree with this, Trayvon Martin's murder was kind of the catalyst for me. That I was 11 when that happened. And I think what pushed me to realize, like, I can't be quiet when I have access to things like a fantastic education. I have access to healthcare. I have access to these things, was Sandra Bland's murder, because that could be me any day of the week. She got pulled over for speeding. That, like, I've been pulled over in Mission Hills, and ever since her murder, it has never left my mind, because that's me. a Black woman driving, you know, and she ended up murdered and her body propped up for a mugshot. So, you know, it makes me feel like I have no choice but to speak, because if I don't, then I'm disservicing anyone else who wanted to speak but either didn't have the access point to, or for somewhat other reason can't, you know, because they don't have time to take off work, or they can't, you know, I don't know, you know, I just feel like I'm in a position of privilege in other areas that I have to acknowledge those things and be able to speak on them.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's such a real challenge, and it's, you know, you want to call it somewhat of a labor of love, but it's almost a labor of obligation that can be exhausting at times, to consistently put yourself forward and be completely open and vulnerable for folks that don't always acknowledge the vulnerability and the energy that it takes to do that. So I want to open that question up to other folks as well.
So part of the response is theological, part is experiential. And the theological piece, you know, just comes from what I perceive as core Jewish values. So pikuach nefesh, sanctity of human life, plugs right into Black Lives Matter. And if you, actually as recently as this morning, but it's not the first time, the Reverend Dr. William Barber with the Poor People's Campaign has really focused on this idea of whether or not you are anti-death. And he really frames it not just in terms of police-involved shootings and police brutality and racial profiling, although that too, but also in healthcare access, in housing, in, you know, in all sorts of things, particularly with, you know, COVID-19 and the disproportionate impact that the pandemic has had on the Black community. You know, values like not oppressing the stranger and loving the stranger certainly plug into that. But also Charlottesville. So what we know as Jews is that if there's hate going around, soon enough it'll land back on us as well. And while I'm really assiduous about really not pushing Jewish issues in Black space, because I think it's important just to say I'm here because it's the right thing to do, and the injustice actually matters. Eventually, if you are there in that space long enough and developing relationships, as you are concerned about the people with whom you care about, they become concerned about you as well. So then it starts to happen in the other direction also.
Thank you. There's often a saying, you know, no one's free until we're all free. And all of our liberations are mutually tied together. So thank you for that.
And I'll just add one other piece is that for me, I resonate with all of the values that Rabbi Alpert said. And I think for me, as I was sort of reflecting about this question when we got it in advance, all of those things impact my thinking and feeling around social justice. And I think that's the word that I hear used most often in the Jewish community is our commitment to social justice, to tikkun olam. And I don't know how much I have heard explicitly in Jewish settings a commitment to racial justice specifically. And I think when people talk about social justice, they mean to include racial justice under that umbrella. But I think that particularly now there is a value for the Jewish community to be explicit about the Jewish values that drive a support for racial justice.
Absolutely.
And I think to answer some of the questions rolling through the chat box, I've seen a kind of recurring question of what do you do for Jews who don't think systemic racism exists? And back to my earlier point of like, yeah, you can't shake how someone was raised, but I think everyone can kind of understand that from a systemic basis, if the majority of Jewish people are white, look at the experience of Jews of color and Black Jews. If you're given the same system, we can understand that the idea that, you made it out, or your family could still, was economically mobile and socially mobile, Jews of color haven't had that same experience. So if we talk about things like, oftentimes, especially in conversations with Black Lives Matter, Jewish history and Black history for some reason have been really conflated, and they're two very, very separate things. And I think why that becomes an issue when we try to compare them is because there were still Jews of color during the Holocaust. There were Jews of color during, race riots in the 60s and 70s. Jewish people and Black people aren't two different groups of people, because Judaism's a religion, meaning anybody could be a part of it. And so I think a lot of the time the danger becomes when we try to split, Jewish people and Black people, it's almost to erase the idea that Jews of colors exist when we talk about systemic racism. Because if the Jewish people can make it through this supposedly racist system, it's like, well, you all didn't make it. The white Jews made it through. And, the white Jews with access to money and the access to healthcare and the access to education, which, the intersectionality of class and sexuality and race all plays into all of these things. But the danger becomes when we conflate history groups when we're talking about systemic racism, because it's not the same game here.
Sure. And I think it's really important that we keep in mind that intersectionality also plays a role in what happens within the JOC community. I think about Althea Bernstein, who is a Jew of color that was attacked and had an accelerant thrown at her for being a person of color. And so now it's not only a person that identifies as a person of color, but someone that also identifies as Jewish. So when there's a physical attack against someone specifically because of their identity categories, but then they have multiple identity categories, it changes like how close that hits to home. And I think that's something that's really important for folks to think about. So I did have one other question, but I also want to honor some of the great questions that have come in through our Q&A. So the one that came in pretty earlier, or pretty close to our beginning, was they're interested in us sharing how identity conflict has played a role in your life. So I think that I'll kick this off and then push this, because I think I understand the question. So for example, there's oftentimes a tension point between, if you are African American or Black identified and also Jewish, that there's going to be tension between the communities. So one minute you're in the predominantly Ashkenazi community as a Jew of color, but you're only being seen as a person of color, not quite Jewish. And then if you were outwardly Jewish in your observance, and then you go into the Black community, then there's a misconception that everyone in the Black community is going to discount you because you're Jewish and you don't fit there either. So, but actually what ends up happening is you become more or less a nexus between the two communities, and a little bit more of a bridge. And yes, there can be some conflict in there that I've seen, but more than anything else, there's real opportunity for learning and growth. But I want to open this up to our panelists as well.
Yeah, I would say, Nate, I pretty much wholeheartedly agree with, you kind of become the token conduit between the communities and patching everything together. But I think really the big, eye-opening thing for me was acknowledging that the Black community is not going to discount you for being Jewish, because the idea of Black religion isn't Christianity. The biggest religion amongst Black people for the longest time was Islam. So knowing that, another religious minority plays such a large role in the Black community makes a much more comfortable space for another person a Black person entering as a religious minority. Because I think what happens oftentimes is we think, the Black community is Southern Baptist, and because of that, we can't, have these conversations, when that's not true. And I think that opens the door for a lot of what we talk about, the intersectionality and the inner workings of really attacking these issues from an educational standpoint rather than from a theological one. Because when you enter a theological argument with someone from a completely different headspace, there's never a wrong answer, but you're never going to get to a collective answer. So I think that's where what's the word I'm looking for? The, amicable point comes from, is when we can acknowledge, we're people, but we're also people coming from much different angles. That isn't maybe what the unified perception would be.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Plugging in a different dynamic, and actually it goes back to our earlier comment about jazz and a jazz reference. There's a book called Jews and Jazz by Charles Hirsch. And what it points out is, so it explores why Jews have such an affinity for jazz. And where it lands, and I think it's true beyond an affinity for jazz, is that the reason Jews liked it is because it gave us both a sense of an insider and an outsider status. So in a way, as American music, it made us feel more apart. It made us feel more American. It made us, more, in some ways, the perception of being more accepted. Yet we always like being outsiders on some level as well. And, jazz was seen as somewhat of a rebellious art form. I used to teach jazz history courses. I always taught it as a Black art form and said, you can't understand jazz without understanding that. So it, in a way, maybe not for all the right reasons, but it connected us as outsiders, and in that sense, gave us some connection to the Black community. At least that was perception. And for myself and my friends growing up and our own love for jazz, I suspect that outsider thing was a piece of it.
We have time for about two more questions from the audience. Okay, so this question is, why is education not the only answer in dismantling the racist nation we have grown into? My parents tend to say education is the root of all of this, while I feel this doesn't address the root causes of systemic and institutional racism. And anyone that feels called to answer that, please.
I love this question because I get it all the time of like, if you can have such a great education, everything fixes itself. And, we have racism because KCPS is such a bad, educational system. And it's like, no. A great thing I learned from a book club a month or two ago was the difference between education and learning. And what the United States has been doing is learning. You learn about the linear progress narrative of slaves got here, we had the Civil War, we had civil rights, and here we're at now. And it's kind of been boom, 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 not with the, we say Reagan was 40 years ago, but you're still facing all of the effects. Civil rights was 50 and 60 years ago, you're still dealing with the same issues. What learning does is it propagates and maintains the systems of white supremacy. It maintains those same storylines that we get fed all the time. Like, I had to wait till I got to college to understand that the Black Panthers weren't like an anarchist terrorist group, because that's what you're taught. You learn that, these people were feeding the hungry in the Black community, and somehow that was un-American and unpatriotic. And really, it's because the government did not want that to happen, and they were killing off any leaders that did that. So I think it really has to stem from the ironic idea that racism is so American that when people try to oppose it, you're looked at as un-American. Once you detach racial justice from being un-American, then you can actually start chipping away at what these kind of systems of domination look like. Where in food security does it reach? Where in healthcare and affordable housing does it reach? Where in vocational activities? Where in trade? So it's like, once you start actually acknowledging that it's not this kid didn't get to take calculus in high school and therefore that's why they don't understand racism, I think at that point you can actually attack what's going on rather than being able to kind of, shadow box it and set it aside as that's somebody else's issue.
That was so powerful, and I agree wholeheartedly. I would just add that I do think in terms of where education and learning can be a part of that equation is we need to be teaching everyone about these issues in the correct way and about systemic racism, right? Like, it's not necessarily just that everybody needs to be taking a calculus class, but why aren't we taking, a class on sociology and American values and understanding the ways that white supremacy affects our society on all of these different levels? Like, that's the kind of education I think that would be really helpful to give people so that they can be actively anti-racist, hopefully, moving forward with their lives.
and I also think that it's not just a dichotomy, right? Is it education or systemic racism? Because the status of our educational system in so many places is a function of systemic racism and the defunding of public schools that happened with white flight, and the, right, if schools are funded through the tax base, and right, the wealthy schools, right, schools in Johnson County, right, have a higher tax base than schools in the inner city, right, that has a direct reflection, right, on the resources that that people have available to them. And so, right, it's not just an either or, it's all sort of interconnected.
And to the extent that you're framing education as somehow some kind of effort to change hearts and minds, to convince racists that they shouldn't be, I don't have a lot of patience for that. It's systemic racism which dictates the need for systemic change, which is policy change. And it's really about people, you know, without power amassing sufficient power to make change. So I think that's where the efforts are better spent. I'm fine, you know, yes, I think curriculum change needs to happen and real history needs to be taught, absolutely. But in terms of where you're creating equity and a more just world, I would tend to more focus on policy and, you know, giving power to those without, to the disenfranchised, and particularly Black community, Latinx community, people of color.
So we are coming right up on the hour right now. And I imagine we could continue this discussion for another hour and still barely scratch the surface on any of these topics. And so I'd like to start by just saying, or close out by saying thank you to the panelists. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts with us and sharing your knowledge. There's some real knowledge in Kansas City. I'm excited. Like, if this is only a sprinkling of what's there, I'm excited for my next visit when COVID-19 is no longer a thing, God willing. So I just want to close out by saying that, you know, we're coming up on Rosh Hashanah and the new year, and it's been a few months since George Floyd's killing. And that has sparked a lot for a lot of folks as far as what it means to move forward in this moment. It's forced a lot of people to look inward, and it's a very painful thing to sort of reconcile what racism has meant in your personal life and in your institutional life. It's also important to acknowledge that this is not something that happened overnight. 400 years of oppression is not going to be rewritten in 2020. It's not going to be completely, all the harms will not be completely healed in 20 years. The work that we're doing right now is intended for generations to come. Even if in 400 years from now we have a better world, we're not going to be able to experience that as the individuals on this call right now, but it's important to continue to work. As I said earlier, all of our liberation is tied together. We can't have one group feel liberated and it not include everybody. It's necessary for it to be all of us moving forward. So with that, I invite you to lean in and learn. If there were things that you heard today that you were unfamiliar with, please feel free to educate about that. Reach out to the folks in your community that are currently doing this work, learn, collaborate with them, and find ways to be in deep community with the folks of color around you. So with that, I wish you all a Shana Tova, happy sweet new year, and a Shabbat Shalom.